Hey everybody, Laura Sokola here with Vocal Impact Productions. And today I want to welcome all of you back to our LinkedIn Live, YouTube Live. We've got lots of people signed up to join us today for this conversation with me and my guest, Damon Diamore. Damon, it's great to see you again.
You too. I relish any chance I get to have a conversation with you. So thank
Yeah,
you.
you got two Jersey Italians here, so there's going to be a lot of energy, a lot of loud. We're going to keep it clean, promise. And but otherwise, lots of great stuff to talk about today on some challenging topics. And look, that's the nature of leadership nowadays, isn't it? So before we jump into content, as people are joining us, I really want to encourage everybody to drop us a note in the chat. Where are you geographically? What's your industry? And really, frankly, anything that you want us to know about why you're here today. What are you hoping to get out of this? What kind of questions do you have? What topics are you hoping we're going to cover? You know, it's going to be all about communicating in times of crisis, in a leadership role, regardless of where you are. Again, leadership is an image, right? You're perceived as a leader or you're not, kind of regardless of what your role happens to be. And the way that you communicate that is going to either enhance that image or detract from it. So we want to make sure that you take away some great strategies, some great mindset, some great tactics, some great framings to help you take the genius in your brain and the passion in your heart and make sure that it's both are evident when you open your mouth to whoever is in earshot. What are we looking at today? We're looking at the topic of winning stakeholder confidence in times of crisis. And again, everybody feel free to put in the chat where you are, what your industry is, and your interest in being here today. But a new combination of leadership skills really are required to navigate everything that's going on nowadays. There's so much disruption in business systems, in social systems, in relationships of all sorts, in this whole kind of post-COVID global business landscape of sorts. We need to look at how to dissect a lot of that and how to navigate through it and not just survive, but thrive. So let's see, Damon, let me give you a little bit of background about why I've invited Damon to join us in this conversation today. Damon spent more than 30 years working directly with the Fortune 500 C-suite leaders. His work focuses on three primary pillars. Number one, psychological performance. Number two, crisis leadership and storytelling for stakeholders, for helping leaders gain advocacy for communicating their unique value. So, prior to becoming a performance mentor, he built international business units for leading Wall Street firms. He produced a high-profile television show for Hollywood. Worked in venture and corporate innovation. Amex even tapped him to host a show on business for the Discovery Channel. So I think that's pretty cool myself. Damon, share us a fun fact.
Fun fact: one of the two biggest shows that I was honored to be a producer on was The Apprentice with Trump before he was president,
Oh
obviously,
my goodness.
and Undercover Boss, which was amazing because I got to meet so many leaders, CEOs and CMOs mostly, and build out my network. But I was one of the first people that got to cast them for the show. So I did these like 2-3 hour intimate interviews with them one-on-one, and everything poured out. And you started to really see the psychological profiles of these folks, different than the psychological profiles of leaders that I worked with on Wall Street. There was like this gap between the perspective of how folks saw the world. But yeah, it was amazing. And actually, that's how it led me to coaching, because initially one of the undercover bosses asked me for some help with mindset and building resilience and perspective. And I did it because I was friends. And then another one said, "Oh, I heard you helped XYZ person. Can you help me?" It's like, "Yeah, sure, whatever. I'm not really a coach." And before I knew it, I had 14 clients like 3 months later. And
Nice.
a friend of mine who's a big coach was like, "I know you hate coaching and you think it's BS, but you're good at it. So like figure it out." So I kind of Damon, type A Italian Taurus. I was like, okay, I'll go with the flow for the first time. And now it's been 8 years of working with amazing people, mostly women in the C-suite.
And I would imagine that the opportunity to work with senior leaders in the undercover boss space, to hear the kinds of leaders who are going to participate in something like that, have to have already embraced the importance of strategic vulnerability and the willingness to not just acknowledge that there are challenges, something's going on in the company that needs to be tightened up. Number 2, to be willing to find out what it is, even if it's something that they realize is part, due to something they overlooked or that they were contributing to one way or another, and to be willing to put it on television and help the world see where there's a problem in the company. I mean, that's got to be relatively eye-opening.
Yeah, it's really rare to see leaders, especially if they have a high public profile, big egos, willing to be vulnerable. And I saw it back in Hollywood, back in 2005 or six, whatever it was, when YouTube first kind of came on the scene. I was in a marketing meeting with the CMO and a studio head for a studio I was working with, and somebody referenced YouTube, and the studio head was like, "I never saw it. Show me." And we were all like, "Oh my God, he's admitting that in a room full of people." But it wound up being one of the most successful marketing pieces of the campaign, because he was like, "Oh, I get it. Do this X, Y, Z," but not being afraid at all to say, it's the same thing now I tell leaders when they're trying to get, whether it's bringing better innovation practices, whatever. I say, come to the table with a bad idea first and show your team that it's okay, that you're not omniscient, that everybody has ideas. They're not all going to be great. So yeah, vulnerability is key. And it's really hard to find leaders these days that are willing to be vulnerable, even to work with one-on-one. I mean, I only work with 3 to 4 corporate clients a year. Finding those people is sometimes difficult because they don't want to be challenged. They don't want to, be told how things are perceived to be outside of their four-wall mirrored room.
Well, and that's part of identifying, who's a coaching client is who's coachable in the first place. And if somebody's not willing to be vulnerable, not willing to share challenges, not willing to be open to constructive feedback and suggestions and receiving it from various perspectives, then they're not really coachable. I said to one person once in that initial conversation, I said, all due respect, you're not looking for a coach, you're looking for a cheerleader.
Yeah.
That's somebody else. So good luck. Have a nice day. But
Yeah.
and hopefully they found what they were looking for, but it was not going to be me. So, but let's get back to the crisis kinds of communication, because heaven knows if you're not willing to look at vulnerabilities within the organization and where your own strengths and weaknesses are, then handling crises like we've been having in well, frankly, forever. But I think people are really, really clearly able to put fingers on a lot more of the trajectory of crises over the last few years. I mean, really from COVID, of course, a couple of years ago being the biggest massive shift globally, to then, of course, things like the war in Ukraine, the recent overturnings of trains in Ohio, parts of California getting dumped on with 12 feet of snow, and most recently, banks collapsing. And I mean, this is terrifying stuff. So apparently, it's not really a question of what happens if a crisis strikes. It's just a matter of which crisis and when, and whether or not you can predict that, which is always questionable. But with all that, knowing that the next crisis is going to be unique, most likely, and it's just around the corner at any given moment. What are some of the key patterns that you've noticed that separate the leaders who thrive in those contexts versus those who just survive, and frankly, those who don't survive during massive crises?
Sure. The number one trait, and this is, a lot of people throw this word around, but it's resilience. And it's not, the leaders that survive and thrive don't look at resilience as a tool in their toolbox to pull out whenever things go wrong. It's a lifestyle, it's a mindset, it's a perspective and a worldview, as how they see the world every day. And part of that is not lying to themselves, being honest with themselves about what the actual circumstances are. I like to call it pragmatic optimism. You look
Mhm.
at the world in an optimistic way, but you have a filter of realism over that. And there's a whole bunch of things I could talk about that if you want. But the leaders that are successful learn to get comfortable being uncomfortable. They have a higher tolerance for ambiguity, especially as people look to them for answers. They realize they're not going to know some or even all the answers at some point. During 2020, in the beginning of it, nobody knew anything. And they learn to shift from a reactive to a proactive mindset as things are coming down the pipe. They're still being proactive and leading forward and kind of mission focused, and that inspires confidence in the team. For my book, I interviewed probably 80 CEOs so far,
And tell
and
us, your upcoming book is called what?
it's called the New Zero, which is what I call the new environment. Basically,
And we'll get to that. I don't want to derail from the story you were telling, but okay, so
yeah.
everybody put a pin
So
in that. The New Zero, Damon's book, he's going to talk about that in a couple minutes, which is going to talk about all this kind of stuff. So continue.
Yeah, so there's a leader of a very CEO of a very high profile quick serve restaurant company everybody would know. And when the crisis started, it's supposed to be 2 weeks and 3 weeks, and people were unsure what was going on. He had a national call with thousands of these cashiers and stuff, people that flip burgers, and said, "This is actually what's going on with the numbers, what we can sustain, what we can't." And he got a call from a board member after. He said, "Why would you share all that information? That's like board level stuff. That's not for the average employee." He said, "Everybody needs to know where they stand." And when I interviewed him earlier last year, 2 years past 2020, they had the highest retention of workers for that category than anybody else, because people just want to know what's going on.
Mm,
And the biggest thing that I saw in 2020 is a lot of the leaders in the C-suite, large, small, public, whatever organizations, they'd never experienced a true crisis, because if they were in the C-suite, unless it's a private family business, they weren't around in 2008 in the leadership role of that scale. So they really didn't have any frame of reference for being in crisis, and it hit them so hard. They said, "Oh, I can't wait till this is over." But it's not. It hasn't ended. When they thought it was over for a week, what happened? Supply chain issues, right? What happened when the supply chain kinks got worked out? Talent retention, talent markets off the charts. You can't keep anybody. What happened after that? There might be a war. There's regulatory risk. There's, riots in 15 cities, and brands have to respond to that is consumer facing. It's just been
yeah.
this nonstop barrage of effects from this big bomb that went off in 2020, and it's not getting any better anytime soon. And people need to realize they need to accept that they're going to be in a state of crisis, but learn to operate without a scarcity mindset, without being, constantly on eggshells. You need to be able to project confidence, and they do that through taking very specific steps towards, shifting the new profile of their leadership style.
So I'm curious because you mentioned just now the ability to project confidence, and when you're facing things like an unknown virus that is wiping out massive swaths of population, and supply chain issues, and all these things at once, it's unsettling for everybody. It's got to rattle people down to their core. So how do you project confidence if you don't necessarily feel it, without going into that cliche of, well, fake it till you make it, or, that kind of stuff? Because the balancing of the authenticity with the need for authority versus everybody scrambles all those ideas in their mind. And then we end up wrestling with these ridiculous false binaries. Well, I can be honest or I can project confidence, but when I'm not feeling it, what do I do? How does that all that gel?
Well, the first thing is that you need to be able to make decisions. I say indecision is the enemy. You can flash freeze for a second like everybody else does, but you need to get to work. And one of the ways that you do that is focusing on what you can control. Virus, XYZ, world coming to an end. There's still at least one variable in that equation that you can control. So it's a very stoic philosophy. Focus on what you can control, focus on your perspective of the world and your reactions to things, but everything else you got to kind of let go. And once you do that, once you have at least one thing to focus on, whether it's retaining your employees, keeping them safe, keeping your supply chain open, letting your customers know that they're going to get their products and services delivered, you need to focus on consistency, focus on process, and focus on presence. There's no secret, there's no hack. It's literally like doing the work. And when everybody else who's been freaking out sees you doing the work and having accountability and being transparent with them, at some point it's like, okay, we need to get back to work. Like Laura's back to work. We're focusing on what we can, and that's something. So that's like the very first part. And the second part of that is your mindset and your identity, how you see yourself in the world, how other people perceive you, knowing that you are enough. A lot of people get into this
Mm.
scarcity mindset where they say the world's ending, I can't control anything, I'm worthless, I have no value in this equation. But it's like, no, you are enough, because people are going to survive this. And I've seen businesses go off the cliff. I've seen other businesses thrive from it. And the third thing is stop wishing it was something else.
Mm.
I always tell people, don't hate the game, love the game, accept the rules, because you're playing the game. So wishing that this would end, or that somebody's going to come out with a vaccine or a policy or this, and it doesn't work. You need to realize that you can only focus on what you can control. And you will be in the top 5% of leaders at that point in the beginning of a crisis, still making proactive decisions.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, and there's so much that you just so many different points you just hit on that I was writing as you were talking that I feel like we each of them, we could take an hour on a piece, but, I think from both a personal and a professional aspect, that notion of being enough. So many of us, whether it leads to the imposter syndrome or fear of personal intimacy in relationships or whatever else, that concern, really, I think all human uh, decisions or bad decisions often, but the um, resistance to moving forward and the fears of taking risks of sorts are all driven by two deep down rooted human fears, and it's the fear of failure and rejection and the fear of not being enough.
Yep.
More personally, not being lovable, but ultimately not being enough one way or another. And it's so important to recognize that that's not just why you're afraid of committing in relationships, but it's also about why we are often afraid to make big decisions in business. The what if I make a mistake? What if we can go on what I like to call the death spiral of what if questions. And it's the wrong question.
Yeah.
Because what does it mean to even be enough? Does it mean to be perfect? Because that's nobody, and that's absolutely a wild goose chase, if not a red herring, or pick whatever random metaphor you like. But it's an unattainable goal. So if the idea of unless you're perfect, you'll never be enough, then no one out there will ever do it. So getting past stop asking questions that are moot in the first place. Um, and I love the idea of just wishing it was something else. That's a nice thought. It go along with the brain freeze, stick
Yeah.
with it for 30 seconds, have that flash freeze, and then snap out of it. But so what I heard, as far as controlling what you can, doing the work, all those kinds of things, it sounded like, tell me if I'm understanding this correctly, a big part of what makes successful leaders successful in these places is that they're not afraid of making that decision, or if they are, it's not. I mean, everybody has some fear. So let's not make it black and white, right? It's not like what is courage? Courage is feeling the fear and doing it anyway. It's not being fearless. So within that, taking heart, taking courage, and then when you make the decision, it's about committing. You make the decision, you commit to the decision, and thus you then commit to doing the work. You commit to getting the outcome that you are going to have. You control what you can, like you said, along the way, but it's passionate commitment to seeing something through. And that's where you can have confidence. You can have confidence in your commitment to seeing something through, if nothing else. Am I interpreting this right? Am I putting pieces together?
Yeah, it's 100%. Decision making, execution, confidence, accountability, all reviewing all that stuff is important. The baseline of that, though, from the psychological profile is, first of all, telling yourself that you're enough, but believing yourself that, see how you're composed right now. Would you listen to yourself as an authority figure? Like maybe not, right? So first of all, get control of that. And there's this great thing that I love to do. It's there's a world outside telling me who Damon Diamore is. There's a world inside telling me who I am. Which one am I going to listen to? Right. And I take time every day in the morning with my affirmations after meditation to remember that and remember who I am and what my authority is and why, and be honest about my gaps or whatever. But I know if somebody asks me a question about XYZ, I know I'm one of the experts to talk on that. So, and also when you talk about operating in fear, everybody's going to be afraid. It's how you operate in a fear mindset. Tony Blauer is a coach and is a friend of mine, and he for 40 years he's been studying the psychology and reactions and adaptation to fear. And there's a process for gaining control, like stopping that fear loop in the middle of it. And the people that learn how to stop it and create a new narrative and then go live that narrative and lead that narrative and execute that narrative, that's a real skill set.
Yep.
So you can't do any of this stuff about your business until you realize that, oh, the voice I hear in my head, I believe that that's worthy of being an authority. So I'm going to listen to myself, and then other people should listen to me. So it's really, there's a lot of, and you said, afraid you're not going to be loved. This is even much different between men and women, at a base level, even in loving, supportive, nurturing environments, Most boys are raised to and being told, "You're gonna grow up, you're gonna go slay dragons, you're gonna go, like, build businesses and be a rock star and do whatever and, like, and save everybody." And they're like, "Oh, yeah, like, I'm enough. I can go do that, you know, I'm a hero." Most women, as little girls, are told, "You're gonna grow up and you're gonna find the perfect man, and he's gonna give you babies and a house and, like, and fulfill your life." So most girls are told from a young age, "You're not enough," even in a loving, nurturing way. And that translates all the way 30 years down the line to in a leadership role, believing that it's your job to take care of everybody else before yourself, which is 180 degrees away from what you should be doing. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that once you start getting into this, there's business execution and leadership tactics, but in a crisis, you need to know who you are, and other people need to believe who you are, and you need to be able to understand yourself. I mean, I suggest all my clients are in like deep therapy, like really dealing with all that stuff, you know?
And it's interesting too because with the uh one of the distinctions I find in the gender gap with the leaders that I end up working with is that in women's circles, terms like the imposter syndrome are pretty common parlance. They're discussed in a lot of supportive networks and there's articles written on it and stuff. More often than not, the men that I work with are experiencing it in one way, shape, or form because everybody says, "Oh my gosh, I'm now here." The expectations are ridiculously high. The pressure is incredibly high. The performance requirements, the KPIs, and all that kind of stuff are off the charts, much higher than I've ever had to do before. Am I capable of this? But they've never heard that phrase. And when I mention it to them, they'll go, "Oh my gosh, it's a thing." Thank goodness. It's so nice to know that it's actually a thing. It's not just me being a wuss inside or having this kind of unique doubt in myself. So it is something I think that can be universal, especially when, as they say, the fit hits the shan. And the most recent crisis, smacks us all in the face to suddenly go, "Oh my gosh, what do I do? How can I be enough to handle this?" So it's to anybody out there, whether you've been raised to think that you're supposed to slay dragons or find someone who's going to slay the dragon for you, uh, either way, we all have that internal moments of crisis. And if you never have that worry of, "Oh my gosh, how am I going to handle this newest thing?" If that's never crossed your mind, then you probably have other stuff in there that's way beyond either one of our abilities to handle from an ego perspective.
Yeah, but the good news is that most people think it's black or white or binary, that you can be both. You can embrace your feminine traits as a leader, but also embrace masculine traits so that the most successful people, even Jamie Dimon, you read his shareholder letter or you see him on CNBC, there's a bunch of feminine heroine's journey, virgin's promise stuff that he's dropping in there to balance it out. You can lead by values and impact and legacy, but you also need to be able to learn to stop focusing so much on the immediate and think bigger long term and communicate those stories bigger and long term, because whether it's venture capital or corporate, by and large women believe that the results will speak for themselves, but they really don't. People want to
Mhm.
hear the bigger story of what's ahead. So, and that's a very male, traditionally male trait, along with, being more confident, being more comfortable with risk taking. Sometimes it's about finance skills. The biggest thing is learning to self-validate over seeking external validation, because a lot of men, whether it's ego or just being indignant or whatever it might be, they're like, "Yeah, I am enough. Like I know what I'm doing is right." They'll walk out there and tell 100 different investors they're going to create cars that fly or whatever until they find somebody to give them money to do it. Whereas traditionally, it's more of a feminine trait to seek external validation for a whole bunch of reasons we can talk about. Not that that's a bad thing, but in order to lead and effectively, and especially in crisis, you need to have an almost absurd confidence in your abilities to make good decisions, to execute on them, and that if somebody is challenging your authority, you need to learn how to defend that authority and squash that through storytelling and data, etc., or move on. Be like, you are no longer you no longer fit the profile of a stakeholder for me, my company, my employees, my business, my customers, our values, whatever that might be. And it's hard sometimes. It's like we don't have to fire a client. It's like you don't want to do that, but it's like you're not going to benefit because you're not in the headspace, whatever it might be, in order to benefit from this work. you know?
There's and you mentioned I wanna go into that storytelling piece because, you mentioned that it's funny because you framed it as more female orientation. I find that it m it it has been, yes, something that women will often do, but also that it's probably the opposite of not just a male thing, but a white male traditional what was the cornerstone of a modern American corporate culture, which was that demographic. So because the idea of the of your work speaking for itself is something that I typically work on, not just with women, but also with people from different countries who are not necessarily native English speakers, more traditional cultures, more cultures that value humility more than self promotion. Not necessarily, they view self promotion as arrogance. We just view it as if you want the job, why would I know that if you don't tell me? You need to add self advocacy. Let's put it that way. And
Yep.
so the need for people to be, and frankly, even in let's beyond that, and it depends on your vertical. And if you're more of my clients who have been in the STEM areas, the financial analysts, the engineers, the numbers people, the data scientists and stuff who now are at the top and want to work on that communications piece, realize that they're again, the numbers are numbers, they should speak for themselves, and they don't. The ability to tell the story of the numbers, so it's almost like those who, uh, think it shouldn't speak for itself and that they need to is really the minority, ironically, that most people I find have a hard time telling the story of the data and or that telling the story of their work rather than just anticipating that the boss should recognize everything that they've done. So let's get into storytelling a little bit because I know that's also, part of your fun
Yeah,
sa
yeah, it's a big part of what I do. Really quickly though,
Please.
I love that you mentioned humility because I think it was Korn Ferry. They did a survey of about 1,500 female executives in the C-suite, and the highest trait that was common across them was humility. They were able to ask for help, and because they were in a certain way, people were more willing to help them. The lowest trait that they had was confidence because when asked how much of their fate they control in their career, they said little to none. Like they really believed they had very little control over their fate. And when they dove into the background, the most successful ones that had higher degrees of confidence had supportive parents, usually father figures,
Mhm,
that didn't just instill resilience and work ethic, but demanded equal or even higher standards of output than their brothers or whoever
mm,
it was. So it's fascinating. You can dive down the rabbit hole of all of this,
sure.
but you can lead with humility, but also lead with confidence and assertiveness. Like it's not an either or. Um,
Absolutely, and frankly, I think, the additional layer to that is how do you operationalize that? What does humility look and sound like to you? Because it's a degree, it's not a question of on or off switch, and when you start getting into other layers of, where were you raised? What's your family's cultural traditions and heritage and things, it goes hand in hand with respect.
mhm.
What does it mean to respect your boss, to show respect to your peers? Does respect mean humility? Does respect mean I can't contradict you? Does humility mean I should never ask for something? Does humility mean so how we operationalize those terms is a huge gap between what I think I say and what you think you hear. And that creates that miscommunication on so many levels. So be learning how to advocate yourself with humility to find that contextually mutually accepted shade of gray for how strong is just right, how forward is just right, that is still humble but confident. Is it possible to do so? And of course it is. It's just a matter of what does it look and sound like to the other person.
Yeah, and it depends on culturally also. I
Yes.
mean, I taught second year MBAs for 7 years at USC, and somebody who was grown up Irish Catholic on the East Coast, female student, had a much different idea of humility and even what's acceptable for them to voice versus my female Asian expat students, who some of them were just totally told, "Don't even raise your hand in class. This is for the boys." It's like, what are you talking about? Well, okay, now you're in America, and you're gonna walk into Goldman or PwC or EY or whatever, and how do you build the confidence and learn, have your own definition of what's humility and what's acceptable, and when does a boss, even though they have a higher title, deserve respect from me. Like they have to earn it,
Yes.
you
Yeah.
know? It's
And
like,
that's where I think a lot of people in that cultural situation that you just mentioned, have a hard time reconciling identities, right? How do you accept the who you were raised to be, the values which where we're not judging this is better than that. It's just here's what you were raised to believe is valor, and now suddenly you're in a workplace that says, yeah, no, do the exact opposite, and then we will respect you and we will reward you and whatever else. How do you learn the other way without betraying who you are, without having to give up and swap identities? How do you reconcile those two halves? That's ends up being a lot of the conversation that I have with a lot of my international clients in particular. But
yeah, if it's not natural, you need to learn it, like we talked about with the, so I was on Wall Street, I was 21. I didn't go to some Ivy League school, but I knew my value on the desk. And at one point, I fought back with a supervisor. Um, and somebody came over to me and said, you can't do that. Like he's your superior. And something went off in my head. I see he's not my superior, he's my boss. Like nobody's superior to me. Like I have a specific value as a worker, a human, like all this stuff. And you have to believe that you deserve to have your seat at the table. So regarding storytelling,
yes, let's
okay.
let's go into storytelling here. So what are some of the fundamental tenets of effective storytelling?
It sounds almost counter intuitive, but data, having concrete data that is defensible to support your great narrative. You can tell the best story in the world, but it will fade. The effectiveness will fade over time unless the people that you're trying to convince can go back and look at these data points and say, oh, this is why his plan or her plan is going to work. This is why they deserve to be in that position. Without getting political, since 2016, it's been growing more and more, but I call it this narrative first post factual world. Like facts don't matter nearly as much as they used to. Story wins every time. And even if the data don't support a story and something's found out to be non-factual or blatantly a lie, it's announced and then you kind of move on. But that initial narrative stays, whether it's socially, culturally, politically, in business.
Which
Um,
let's just qualify that one thing. We're not advocating for lying because the
no,
story will
no, no,
stick
no, no,
later on. We're
no.
we're just saying the stories tend to be more powerful than just listing facts,
Yeah,
data
I
points.
I just had this conversation last night with someone, and I said, "You need to tell the best story, but if you want to win over time and you want to last in your position in your category as a thought leader, as a company, whatever it might be, those great stories need to be backed by undeniable data when people can go back and say, oh, she did what they said and said what they meant, like I
Mm,
posted the other day on LinkedIn for the Caesars post. So that's the first thing. The second thing is really understanding who your stakeholders are and that different stakeholders are going to need to be communicated to in different way, whether it's generationally, by their sex, by their experience, by their position, and also understanding that since 2020, as stakeholder expectations on leaders, board members, analysts, shareholders, customers, whatever it might be, just a line straight up to the moon, the room for error has gone down inversely. So you have less room for error and they expect more of you. So how do you address that? The first thing is understanding basic story structure, right? Whether it's 3 points or 60 points, I'll work with corporate clients over this 6-month period with really detailed story points that support their initiatives. But understanding story structure, understanding who your audience is, and then how to speak to those specific stakeholders,
mhm.
whether it means in person and through what means. So over a 6-month period for a company, I might help them with a story for a product release, or story for defending their earnings, or story for asking for a bigger budget of their board meeting. But all those different points become points for thought leadership profiles on LinkedIn, the stuff they talk about on podcasts, content marketing, whatever that might be. So if you know, a story from A to B of where you exist today, where your stakeholders exist today, and how specifically you can get them to this 2.0 version of themselves, everything in between is just, it's a buffet that whenever you need it, you go and you pick from it. We're talking
Mm,
about budget, talking about supply chain, talking about regulations, whatever it might be. Boom, 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 boom. So understanding story structure, understanding that you need data to support that, and then knowing how to communicate that story once it's done. Because if you could have a great story, but if you can't communicate it well, nobody's going to advocate for you or engage with you. And the most important thing about this 2.0 version of your stakeholders is that not only does their worldview change, there's a concrete moment before or after Laura came into their lives, or before or after they advocated for this shift in business strategy, whatever it might be. And that also lends itself back to the new zero. There's a point in time where there's a mirror, whether it's JFK's assassination or 9/11 or COVID or whatever it might be. There's a definite before and after in how people perceive the world and how they interact with it and how they see themselves in it. And you need to know how to lead your stakeholders to that new place, whatever it might be. It's really difficult, and but if you take the time and the energy to do it, it's rewarding. I've had people walk out of board meetings, clients of mine, and say, they gave me everything I wanted. It's like, great. And they don't understand why I'm the only one they can't push around. And it's like, yes, well, A, because you're my client, you're a baller. But B, everything that you're telling them isn't just based on some like big shiny, hey, I'm the best of your thing. It's all backed by concrete data. So like they can't question your authority. They might not agree with you or even like you, but they're going to advocate for you. And that advocacy is, especially in times of crisis, is almost invaluable because they put so much trust in you that you really can pretty much do what you want that you think is necessary.
Then now you used a phrase that I think is important to qualify, um, not in a, or at least to define further for clarity, the how to communicate your story well.
Yeah.
What does that entail?
It entails, first of all, having clear story points, like having clarity in the message that you're communicating, and being specific. We're going to be the biggest, the best, the blah, 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 blah. That means literally nothing, right?
Okay.
It might mean something for a tweet or for, a soundbite when you're on CNBC or Cheddar or Bloomberg or whatever, but you need to have very specific, clear story points. Second thing is, different groups of stakeholders, like your customers versus your board, there's different channels of communication. You're not going to go talk to your customers one-on-one, right? So what are the ways in which they need to be communicated to, the channels? Is it through social media? Is it through email? Is it through content marketing? Is it through holding some event, like whatever that might be? So knowing the channel to communicate that message is almost as important as the actual content of the message. And then the third thing is having some means of calculating and measuring if that message hit. Like you don't just go out and communicate your message and say, okay, I did it. How do you know? Are they engaging with you? Are they advocating for you? Is it more or less than it would have been if you didn't tell this story? Like what are the results that you hope to gain over time? And can you create milestones, and can you create some sort of measurability and accountability? Because you also needed to defend your story as you're telling the story of your company and these great places you're going to go and how you're going to bring investors and shareholders and customers and society in general along with you for changing the world. There's also the story of Laura as CEO, right? These are all data points for your story as you move forward. And it's all going to help you in the future. So hopefully that's a clear answer for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's important because people will say, well, I know I'm supposed to tell my story well, but what does that mean? I thought I've been doing it, but I've been told I'm not doing it well. So what am I doing wrong? And I think looking at number one, are you specific enough? How are you? Really, it comes down to operationalization in a lot of ways. How you mentioned it in the third one, it's okay to have qualitative goals,
Yeah.
but they still need to be measurable. Well, how do you measure something that's qualitative and thus appears subjective? Well, you have to operationalize it with something that is quantifiable, where you can say, that my evidence for whether or not this has happened is, and fill in the blank for you. Is it that people are going to reach out to you? Is it that fewer people are going to be staring at their phones while you're talking to them? Is it that you're going to have increased sales? Is it that you're going to save money? How will you know if you've achieved this particular shift one way or another? You need to have that evidence specifically defined.
And one of the ways, I mean, we just got a question from Yu Wang, I believe. Sorry if I didn't pronounce your name
Yeah.
correctly. How do you make sure that those story points stick? One of the ways is to ask them, right? Like if they're stakeholders, you're going to demand something from them. Like how are they going to advocate or engage with you or give you the resources that you need? So at the end of your pitch or your story or your meeting or whatever it might be, say, as a takeaway, what do you believe that your next step and responsibilities are to me in order to go execute this great strategy that you tell me you now believe in? So one of the ways you make sure the points stick is asking them, what did they hear? Did they hear what you said? Because sometimes there's a delta between those two things. And the best way to ensure clarity, you don't have to become a great writer. I'm not a great writer, but literally writing things down and then reading them out loud to yourself. Does that make sense? Because there's no inflection in the words on the paper. So is it clear what you want and why? And I've gone through this. Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes I'm like, that makes no sense ever. It made sense in my head because you live your life in your head. So be clear and have a way of measuring, and also ask your stakeholders and ask them along the way. Like you're not going to have an initiative or a strategy or a product release XYZ and then just be here in your successful milestone. There's going to be milestones along the way. So each way, ask them for some sort of engagement, whether it's feedback, whether it's it could be a number of things. But if they are consistently and increasingly engaging and advocating to support whatever your initiative is, then those story points are sticking. And if at some point you might do two things right and then engagement falls off, you need to really look at like, okay, why were they supporting me then and not now? It could be something you said in an interview, could be some messaging that you thought was great and now it's totally convoluted and people don't understand what your values are anymore. Yeah, the values shifts are a big thing. The last 3 years I've seen a lot of big publicly or consumer facing companies lose ground because they thought they were doing something right to address the social situation, and the negative feedback was overwhelming because they didn't ask any of their stakeholders how they wanted to be framed in this situation as customers of ours who support these values. They just said, oh, this is right. Well, it might be right for you, but not right for everybody that buys your product. And you lost total control of your narrative because you no longer have control with the Super Bowl ad to say this is who we are. A million people on their phone on Twitter are like, bashing, canceling, do this, do that. This is what they meant. So how do you regain control of your narrative? That's some of the work that I do also.
Yes. And being able to take it back when somebody else starts to derail it and redefine the narrative for you. That's always a scary place to be, and social media is vicious that way, to say the least.
And not take it back in a defensive way. Take it back in a way that is convincing that like, oh, of course, somebody misinterpreted that. And now we believe that Laura's operating from the place that we all thought she was operating on. It was a great long 20, 30-minute argument between Bill Ackman and Carl Icahn years ago on CNBC, where one of them was bashing the other. And the other guy just called in. And they had this like titans of industry back and forth live on CNBC. And by the end of it, people were like, okay, agree with or not agree with either of them. I understand why they're doing what they're doing. Their points are so clear that, it's like, I saw Bill Clinton once, who's an amazing, he could, sell ice to Eskimos or whatever. He was on Larry King right when the Iraq war started. And Larry King said, like, what do you think about all this? And Bill Clinton said, well, I learned really quickly when I was president that you can lead how the world really is, or you can lead how you want the world to be. And it's your responsibility to lead how the world is, which comes back to my pragmatic optimism and being a realist. And then hopefully you make enough success, you have enough success all along the way and enough authority and enough value that then you can start making changes to make the world the way you want it to be. But it's all about, we'll take it back to 45 minutes ago. Like, don't lie to yourself because there's other people that are going to know. They're like, oh, I'm locked in my house and there's no groceries in the store. Like, what is this guy talking about? Everything's going to be fine.
Right. People's reality may be very different from what you're claiming if you're not aware of anything outside of your own refrigerator at that point. So so you just mentioned that we've talked about narrative, we've talked about performance and a couple of things. So I think this is a good opportunity as we start to run towards the end of the hour here. I want to make sure we have a chance to talk about your book with New Zero. And what is it? Because these are all topics that you're covering in there. So give us a quick rundown. What is the New Zero?
Sure. So the New Zero started off as a program that I did for crisis leadership in April 2020 with some of my corporate clients. I put together
right as COVID hit. Okay.
Right as COVID hit. So, February 2020, I got really sick. I got COVID from 12 CEOs. I gave a closed speech to that just came back from a 2-week trip to China. We were all in the same room.
Lovely.
11 of us got really sick. I was better by the time the lockdowns came, but um, 2 weeks after the lockdowns, and it was clear that it wasn't going to stop, all my contracts froze. It was like, we don't know what's going. So, oh my God, what am I going to do? And I had CEOs and presidents and CFOs and CROs and CMOs calling me, freaked out, basically giving them free advice, like basically giving them free coaching because they couldn't even process an invoice. And finally, one of them said, I think I can get a approval for crisis coaching. And in my mind, that's just like PR. It's like, oh, your CEO gets caught doing something you shouldn't have done in Vegas, and now there's like a crisis communications. And they said, no, dude, your program is about performance and mindset and psychological performance, which is relevant in the crisis. It's about storytelling, which is more relevant than ever now. And it's about making sure that your stakeholders understand what you're trying to do. So I put together a 5-page proposal and I sent it to one of my clients, former clients. I said, if you know anybody that can use this, and they said, we start on Monday, like this is what we need. And then it became more and more. And over the first 2 years, from 2020 through 2021, it was rebuilding these pillars of taking people live in the moment of crisis and having them stop that fear loop and having them get control of and some clarity and emotional relief, and working on their mindset and their identity, working on building resilience, learning to craft a story in a different way than they've always traditionally been told how to do. And the concept of the new zero, as I mentioned before, is that there's no new normal. Nothing is normal. Nobody can anticipate any of these future shocks. So you need to operate as before and after. Everybody knows where they were when COVID hit and lockdown started. Everybody knows when businesses started freezing up. Everybody knows when social fabric started to break down for the first time since the 60s, right? When some of us weren't even alive. So that's the concept of the new zero. You are starting off with a new 0 point. How you operate, how you live, how you thrive, how you succeed, how you interact with other people has changed implicitly. And all those former leadership traits that are successful leaders, all the hundreds of thousands of books that have been written, doesn't make them irrelevant. But what goes to the top of the pile now is psychological performance, having confidence, having clarity, having emotional confidence, being able to identify your stakeholders' needs, and then tell a story that actually is going to get you what you want, get you the engagement, and get you the advocacy, and then measuring it, etc. So and then there's a fourth pillar of the book, which is women's leadership skills, how they're changing over the last few years with everything from social, political, business. So I'd say about probably more than half of the CEOs that I interview for the book are women. And I have a whole lot of data, both firsthand and through their stories, about how I love working with women. They're so much tougher than guys, like hands down. Like a lot of them don't know it though. And then when it comes down to it, when they realize it's okay to be tough, when they have to be tough, it's empowering. Like I've had so many at the end of working together say, I know why I matter, and I know why people should care. Like I know why people should be working with me and supporting me. And that's like so empowering, and I do it for men also, obviously, but women are starting at a different level. They have to at least get up to sea level first with that confidence and then go past it. Not all of them. There's definitely types of people, but
of course,
the mass distribution of the curve, that 80% to 90% of the bell curve, you need to realize that you're off. And some people don't want to be honest with themselves. They don't want to believe the world's changed.
Yeah.
I saw companies pivot during the crisis in order to survive, and then when they thought everything was fine, go back to their old business models. And they've all been acquired in roll-ups now, or gobbled up by private equity.
Yep.
People understood, well, this is our business now, and these are our customers. This is what they expect. This is the new value system. Thriving. And wrap your arms around it, embrace it, hug it so tight that it becomes a part of you. Like just pull it into you, So, and that's what the new zero is about, like learning to operate successfully in this new environment, not just outwardly and putting on a good show as like this, iron, clad leader, but believing it, being comfortable in your new skin, because you got to wear it, whether or not you like it. You can hate the game, but you're playing the game. So.
Yes. Yes, that's a great quote. You can hate the game, but you're playing it. And it's not about game playing. It's just recognizing that, if you're in this role, if you're in this world, there is a metaphorical game of sorts, and, learn the rules, whether it's basketball or baseball or something along those lines. It's not in the manipulative sense of game playing. It's just understanding the court you're on.
Yeah, and I'm not on call 24 hours a day. So when you don't have someone who's building your confidence, advocating for you, telling you how to craft this narrative, how do you deal with it? Like everybody has those moments of resistance. Stephen Pressfield talks a lot about it. But like when you're not doing what you should be doing, really ask yourself why. What is it about? Is it because you don't want to admit it that things are changing? You don't want to admit that you might have not have the right skill set. Ask for help. You know, a lot of leaders during the crisis were afraid to say that they didn't have answers to X, Y, Z because they were like, "Oh, my board's just going to find somebody who does." And I'm like, surprise, nobody does. Like,
Well, during the pandemic, that was for sure.
yeah,
That was a great
but
equalizer.
but now there might have been this much ambiguity. Now there's maybe this much, but there's still ambiguity. But there are definite variables and fundamentals. And if you're not on board with how to operate with the new fundamentals in business, you're not gonna survive. So yes,
Yes.
you might not know some of the answers, but now 3-4 years in, you're expected to know some of the answers. So
Yes. All right. We got a great resource out there for everybody out there. So check out the New Zero. When is it available?
I don't know. Hopefully by the end of the year, I'm working with my editor right now, and
Oh, got it. Okay.
I'm still conducting interviews, which is totally the opposite of what I should be doing. I have 2 more next week. Like I can't get enough good stuff, so it keeps working. In.
Is it a
But
constant flow of fodder at that point?
yeah, but if folks want like the pragmatic optimism article I wrote on LinkedIn, it's on my profile. If people want to connect with me or look at it, that's actually an excerpt from one of the books on performance, chapters on performance. So they can
Nice.
get a little sneak peek of the New Zero through the pragmatic optimism article.
Amazing. And as we're coming to a close, I want to make sure that anybody who's out there who's got questions and has been holding back, please don't hold back. Just go ahead in the chat, throw any additional comments, any additional questions. We want to be sure that we address what it is that you want to know most about it. These are really big challenges. And, the narratives, the mindset and the performance pieces, the ambiguity. For those who do, and I'll let this be my final question with regard to that third pillar of navigating ambiguity, to the extent that there are those who are like, I am a control freak. I love Brene Brown's, if you ever saw her TED Talk, which
Yeah,
is, one of the sort of most watched out there, anybody who hasn't seen it, she kind of defines herself in the beginning as somebody who doesn't just like data and control. She kind of feels like everything in life needs to be kind of categorized, qualified, and otherwise put in a bento box. Like everything should have its category and should fit nicely into categories. Anybody who's done social research, as I certainly did for long enough, knows that data is messy. You have all these great categories. It's like, oh, I'll look for X, Y, and Z. And then 80% of the data you find don't technically fall under any of those categories cleanly. So what do you do when you've got all of this ambiguity because you can't control for all these things that you really feel like you need to be in control of?
you have to really figure out what you can control and only focus on that. Like I have this coaster on my desk. Relax. Nothing is under control. You have to be okay, like sitting in your little zenned out lotus position in a storm, right? In a
Right.
hurricane. Yeah, and also having some means to scrub good data from bad data, relevant data from irrelevant data, like knowing what your stakeholders are focused on, either what they're saying themselves or what people around them are saying. You might have all this data, but you might say, like in 2020, the summer of 2020 for the following year, it was all values-based, ESG, social focused values for company. Nobody cared that I had the best coffee mug, but unless I was supporting their social issues, they didn't want to hear about it, right? So, okay, so what's the data for our demographic around this? Or it could be, there's a new like this Chat GPT is disrupting
Oh my gosh,
everything.
crazy.
I have a venture-backed pal that raised money from like real VCs. His whole business went up in flames when they released 4.0. So it's like, okay, the customers you thought you were serving, what were they actually looking for that's now being, satisfied by this? And what's the data relevant to that? And you know what? If you can't find that data, it's not in front of you, go create your own proprietary data, like figure out a way to interact, do surveys, like whatever it might be, talk to your real customers. But there's too much data out there, and it's a problem. And there are companies out there that help other companies sort through that. But
Sure.
Abraham asked a question at the
Yes.
bottom.
Yep.
Um, there's totally a way to utilize your non-Western cultural background to tell compelling stories in a Western context. At a base level, it's the same way that I help a lot of my female leader clients tell their stories in a male context, because they're telling the same story, but they're telling it in a way that men are hearing it and perceiving it, right? Like Bill Burr has this great skit where he said he's married to an African American woman, and he said, "There's certain times where I know she's saying something, but I'm hearing it through my white male ears, through my white male, processing it through my white male brain." But that needs to happen also at a corporate level. So yeah, feel free to send me a DM or an email, Abraham. I'm happy to talk to you about it. But you can, and it'll be a point of difference that when people hear your story versus other people who are trying to pitch them or sell them or do whatever it is you're doing, they'll remember yours uniquely. You know, it's like whenever I talk to people I haven't seen in a while, they don't say, "Oh, you worked on Wall Street." They go, "Oh, you worked at the top of the World Trade Center." It's all about the details and the stories. Or, "Oh, you produced TV. There's 1,000 TV producers. I remember that guy because he worked with Trump and produced Undercover Boss and blah 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 blah." So, and what do they want to hear? I don't know who you're going to tell your story to in a Western context, but there's definitely ways to craft your story to hit the emotional and the factual points that they want to hear in order to believe it and remember it and have it stick with them.
I think we also want to be careful not to draw too many black and white binaries. So East
Oh
versus
yeah,
West.
yeah,
There's lots that we all bring something unique to the table. We all bring a unique perspective from. And Abraham, it's you have a non-Western background, but and we've known each other for years. But you've been here in the States for 10 years, 15 years. I mean, you may not be here, anymore. I'm not sure where you are geographically at the moment, but there's plenty of experiences. And whether the idea is to figure out what aspects of your experience, of your knowledge, you can leverage, but share it in a way that they can hear it. Because in the end, regardless of what you say, what you communicate is what the other person hears.
yep,
So it's not about, well, I'm just going to tell something in a Chinese way or in a Nigerian way or because even that isn't unique. And I've often asked audiences who are when we're talking about intercultural communications, just by show of hands, how many of you out there have a full genetic sibling who is so different from you, you don't understand how you came out of the same womb? And usually 75 to 80% of the hands will all go up. Okay, so at that point, it's really not just about the East versus the West, the male versus the female, the massive binary distinctions, because you and yourself, I mean, my brother and I could not be more different on so many levels, but it has nothing to do with any of those gross categories or the gender distinction for that matter. So we want to be careful not to overgeneralize on those terms. Regardless, we need to think about who is the audience and what do they need to hear? What do they want to hear? And what do I need them to understand? And from there, how can I frame it in a way that they will be able to hear what I need them to hear?
yeah,
That's really the juggling act that we all try to figure out. Whether it's East versus West, your Eastern heritage will offer lots of different experiences that will make for great stories and that will make for great examples and new perspectives that somebody else may find utterly new. So just pull from that treasure chest as necessary, but deliver it in a way that that brain can hear. I think that's really
exactly.
the issue.
100%. I want just to clarify in case it was misinterpreted. I didn't mean you should take all of your unique experiences and homogenize them to your audience so that they can have this whitewashed whatever thing. No, you communicate them, as Laura said, in a way that they will remember and retain them, but you deliver in that story what makes you unique about your cultural background or XYZ. Like, you deliver your uniqueness in a way that they will understand, comprehend, and remember it. So
Yes. And I
yeah.
think that's a perfect point for us to end on. Damon, how can people find you? How can they learn more?
LinkedIn is the best way. On my profile, connect with me, send me a DM, and say that you heard me on Laura's show. Also, my website, legacymentor.co, little contact form. Tell me what's going on and shoot me an email, and I'm happy to schedule a call with people, talk to them.
Awesome. All right. So hopefully this has provided lots of food for thought for everybody out there about whatever the latest crisis is, and whether or not it's pandemic scale or just an internal crisis in the department or a family crisis or whatever it is. All of these skills really do apply. All these principles matter. So take them to heart, sit with them for a little while, but hopefully we've offered you some strategies and maybe some keys for opening those doors and continuing to move forward. So with that, everybody else out there, please reach out to us. Any questions you want. Same thing, you can of course reach me here on LinkedIn. Go to vocalimpactproductions.com, check out the podcast Speaking to Influence at speakingtoinfluence.com. And otherwise, we look forward to hearing from you on the next time that we meet here on LinkedIn Live. So Damon, thanks as always for joining me. Love our conversations.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great